Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lesson 17, Part 2 now, where we're going to dive into some syntax for grouping, because I'm sure you're dying to know about how to actually write this stuff out. And we're going to get into some real-world examples applying that syntax for grouping. So put your thinking caps on, because this is going to be a good one. Let's dive into it. So let's talk about syntax. Let's talk about how to actually make this happen. So what's a keyword you think that it's associated with grouping data? Okay, well, thankfully it's not too difficult. It's called group by. Okay, it would have been nicer for it just to be called group, but they inserted the keyword by here on purpose because, well, you're going to see why I did that, because it actually makes sense to have it called group by. So let's go back to using the bank account transactions example from before. Remember, debits, credits, etc. So let's say I want to group my transactions by their type, either credit or debit. How would I do that? Well, here's how you do it. Select transaction type from transactions, group by transaction type. Okay? Now, you might be asking yourself, who knows if you're asking yourself this or not, but since I know where I'm going with this particular statement, I know exactly what I would ask myself. I would ask myself, why am I not using a star here? We're so used to seeing select star from transactions or from whatever. So how come I didn't use select star from transactions group by transaction type? Very, very good question. The reason for that is, if you do it that way, the results you get back from our database don't really make any sense. And I'll tell you exactly why they wouldn't make sense. So first of all, let's look at what would happen here. If we say select transaction type from transactions group by transaction type, what's going to happen is, how many transaction types are there? Right? How many transaction types exist? Well, from the example I've given you, really only two: credit or debit. I'm sure in the real world, in real banking scenarios, there's plenty of different transaction types, but in our simple case, we'll just have two: credit and debit. So what's going to happen here is it's going to take all the credit transactions that it can find and put them into the credit bucket, and it's going to find all the debit transactions and put them into a debit bucket. So we're going to have two buckets. Two different results come back. So essentially, the results that are going to come back from our database is just going to be represented by two different buckets. Okay, so we run this query, we're only going to get two rows back. So if we get two rows of data back and we say select star from transactions, again, I'm answering the question, why didn't I use a star here? If I say select star from transactions, but I only have two rows of data to present, then what is it going to show for all the other rows? So if I have inside of my transactions table, if I have some stuff like transaction ID, what else would be in there? Well, let's just say transaction ID. Let's just say it has two columns: transaction ID and transaction type, which would not be practical by any means, but let's make it simple for now. So let's say there's 10 transactions. 5 are credit and 5 are debit. Okay, transactions IDs 1 through to 10, right? 10 transactions, transaction ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 5 are credit, 5 are debit. It's going to group them into two different buckets, but then if we say select star, it needs to show a transaction ID. So that means it has to show, for the credit transactions, it has to show transaction IDs 1 through 5. But it's only returning two rows because we've grouped it by two different types, so it's only going to return two rows. So which transaction ID would it show? Transaction ID 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Well, it wouldn't really make sense to pick any of them, but in MySQL, it's just going to pick the first one and display it. So the resulting rows of data with the resulting columns don't really make sense when you group them together, unless you're talking about the data as it is grouped in that bucket itself. Right? If you're dealing with what's called an aggregate of that data, okay? And so if we say select star, if you're showing transaction ID is not an aggregate of all the data that's in the bucket. It's just one of the data points in the bucket. So it's going to show it, but it's going to be a bit misleading. Now, I'll talk about that in a moment. I believe I go into that in more detail later. If I don't go into detail later, don't worry. You're going to see a lot more about that stuff in the next lesson. So the group by syntax, now that we're moving on, the group by syntax should appear after your select from and where keywords. So you see here it says select from, there's no where statement, but you can assume that maybe we have a condition where we want to only look at transactions for the last 30 days. So maybe we can have select transaction type from transactions where, transaction date is less than whatever date and greater than whatever other dates, to sort of give it a window. But the point being is that the where statement would appear before the group by. So group by is always after select from and where, as well as all the other sort of filtering keywords. So even the and keyword. So, where this and this and this and this, and then you would have group by afterwards. Okay? So group by tends to be at the end of your queries, just as a rule of thumb. So now that we've seen the simple example of this syntax, let's go deeper into this particular example with transactions. Cool. So just to give you more visibility into this imaginary transactions table that I've made up, I actually made it concrete for you. So I created a transactions table, and it has a transaction ID, a transaction date, an amount, and a transaction type. So this makes sense. Think about you making a purchase somewhere. You made a purchase on your credit card or your debit card or whatever, and each one will have its own unique identifier. Each transaction has a unique ID. Cool, fine, great. It also has a date, and this is a date time. So not only do we keep track of when you made that purchase, but we keep track of the specific time you made that purchase as well. We keep track of how much that purchase was made for. So like I said, maybe you bought a $50 gift card or something like that. We'll keep track of it based on the decimal type. And remember, this syntax here, let's go back and do a quick review. What does decimal 10,2 mean? Decimal 10,2 means you can have at most a maximum of 10 digits inside of your number, where 2 of those digits appear to the right of the decimal point. Okay, so we're essentially talking about an 8-figure purchase with 2 decimal places, right? Because you kind of do 10 minus 2 for how many decimals, or not digits, there we go. How many digits will appear to the left of the decimal point. Okay, so 8-figure number with 2 decimals, 2 digits of accuracy. Then we have a transaction type, which is, like I said, either debit or credit, which we will use char, a single char character to represent it, which is either, well, we can see here a C or a D, which represents a credit or a debit. Okay, and here's the data that we have in our transactions table. I've just sort of created a bunch of different transactions. So transaction D1 is a credit of $100. So that's kind of like someone gave me $100. Then number 2 is someone gave me $250, and here maybe this is a paycheck for $1,800, and then all the rest of these are purchases. So I'm buying different items or whatever, and these are all on different dates. Cool. So that's how we have our transactions looking, and then I'm going to take this and I'm just going to put it up on the top here for the next slide, just so you always have reference for what's in the table. So okay, what happens when we run our previous grouping query? Select transaction type from transactions, group by transaction type. This is the same query that we were just looking at. Here's the result. Just like I said, it gives you, so we are just selecting transaction type, so it only gives you 2 rows, C and D. Okay, which makes sense. We're grouping by transaction type. And if you look at the transaction type column, there's only 2 unique data points, either a C or a D. So that's what happens. It groups it into 2 different rows. But this is not exactly helpful, is it? So there's actually a lot more going on behind the scenes that we're not seeing here. So what you're not seeing is that SQL, or rather MySQL, has actually grouped together all 9 of these transactions, transaction ID 1 through 9. It's grouped them together into 2 buckets, bucket C and bucket D. Okay, and again, these aren't buckets, these are just, well, it's kind of like a row of data is how it groups it, but it groups it in such a way that it has the information of each of these rows inside of the grouped data. So again, you can visualize it grabbing one of these rows of data, deciding if it's a C or a D, and then taking the entire row of data and putting it into a bucket that represents the C bucket, and so on and so forth. So MySQL actually has the data behind these two transaction type buckets here that it's showing you. Okay, but we'll need to write a little bit more SQL script stuff to actually unlock the grouped data's usefulness. So obviously, we're going to do that right now. So again, I've left the transactions here for your reference. So now let's add something called an aggregate function into the mix. Again, you heard me use this word aggregate before, where you're talking about it only makes sense to refer to grouped data by the aggregate figures inside of that grouped data, okay? And this is how we can do it. We can do it using these things called aggregate functions. So now the aggregate function that I'm interested in is the one that's in pink here, which is called sum. Okay, so sum is actually going to be the summation of everything inside of a particular bucket. Okay, another word for summation is just the addition. Okay, we're adding together the amount field. So you see I've specified sum of the amount. So if you look at the entire statement here, the entire statement is exactly identical. It's still doing select transaction type from transactions, group by transaction type. But the only difference here is I'm looking to peek behind the curtain at what MySQL has done here, and I'm looking to look at the obviously the sum of the amount field. Again, amount, this word here, comes from the column over here. Okay, that's why I can use the term amount. I can use it because it's an actual column that is being stored in our table. Okay, so if you think about it, it's going to group together each of these transaction types. 1, 2, 3, so 3 different credit transactions, and the amounts are going to be summed together. They're going to be added together via this sum aggregate function. Okay, now look at the result. The result is we have another column, and now this data is much more helpful because we have the transaction type of C with the summed total of the amount field of being 2,209.39 and the summed debit transactions at $312.97. Okay, MySQL can do this for us in the blink of an eye, which is wonderful. So like I said, MySQL has taken our sum function and applied it to each bucket individually, giving us, finally, some useful data. So now at a glance, we can see that we have more credit than we have debit, so we know that the answer to our question here is yes, we are cash flow positive for this month, actually by quite a big margin, so that's a great thing. Okay, so let's briefly go over what you've learned in this lesson, and let's give a little bit of a peek into the next lesson. Grouping data, you've learned that grouping data helps us answer more complex questions about our data. So if you have a question about our data that talks innately about different groups of data, when it's talking about different buckets or different areas of our data that should be sort of aggregated across, that's when grouping comes into play. We're talking about days of the week or hours of the day or what have you. Okay, it doesn't matter if there's any way that you can group the data, then obviously grouping helps us achieve the answers to those more complex questions. Now, grouping is all about placing single data points into buckets and then using those buckets. Okay, well, you can use aggregate functions on group data, like summarizing or summing data together. Okay, so aggregate functions. It's called an aggregate function because it's performing a function on data that has been aggregated by some means. The aggregation in this case we're talking about is grouping the data together. So in the next lesson, we're going to be diving deeper into these aggregate functions. Okay, there's many more aggregate functions that are available. Off the top of my head, I think there's maybe 6 or 7 of them that we can use, and they're definitely immensely helpful when we combine them with grouped data. Okay, that's really where they shine. That's really where you need to use them, is when you are grouping data together. You can use these aggregate functions. So we'll learn about that in the next lesson. I look forward to seeing you there. Bye for now.